Okay, well, I hope I pressed the right buttons, and if I did, I should be live. You should be seeing me right now. So I'll assume that I am live, and I'm assuming this is working. Welcome, everyone. My name is Lior Samfiru. I'm the employment lawyer. And what I'm doing here this evening is I'm here to talk to you about vaccinations in the workplace, talk about your rights, talk about what you can do, what the law says, and everything you need to know under that umbrella. Now, I know there's a lot of questions. I am going to talk and I'm going to cover a lot of topics here. And I promise you in doing that, most of your questions are going to be answered. That said, I will take some questions at the end of this little presentation of mine. So hold on to those until then. For now, just kind of keep up and bear with me because I'm going to, I'm sure, cover many, if not most of your questions that you have with your situation. So again, my name is Lior Samfiru. I'm a founding partner of Samfiru Tumarkin LLP. Well, we're the largest employee side law firm in Canada. And I am here now to talk about things that you need to know. Now, before I get started, let me just give you some contact information. If you want to connect with me or my team after this session to have a private discussion, easiest place to go to is employmentlawyer.ca. Again, employmentlawyer.ca. You'll see a lot of information about vaccines, about COVID-19, your legal rights, severance. You'll also get my contact information, phone number, email address. It's all there. So if you want to connect with me offline, off Zoom, employmentlawyer.ca. Okay, and we're also going to record this session so you can refer back to it. It's going to be on our website, employmentlawyer.ca. You can also refer other people to it. You can always do that if you want to. Now, I'm going to cover a number of things today. I'll talk about vaccinations. Is it legal to require you? Is it not? Do you have to disclose your vaccination status? What happens if you're let go? What happens if you're suspended or put on a leave? What are you owed, or are you owed something? How do government mandates factor into all of this? How do you calculate what you are owed in that situation? And in a bunch of other topics, I'll talk about things that don't work. I'll talk about exemptions. So I'm going to cover a lot of these topics today. So I think you'll find it useful. Now, the one thing I want to say right at the beginning, that pretty much everything we talk about today only applies to non-union employees. Again, I want to be clear, it only applies to non-union employees. And the reason for that is that the only one that's allowed to help a unionized employee is the union. There are no other options. There's no exceptions. So if you're a unionized employee, the only thing I'm ever going to be able to say to you is you have to talk to your union. And I know a lot of you are going to say, well, the union's not helping me. The union is agreeing with my employer. Even then, there's no other options. That's the part of the problem of being unionized, that you have to do what the union says ultimately. You don't have other recourse, okay? So nothing that we talk about today applies to unionized employee. It only applies to non-union employees, okay? Let's be very clear about that. And I can't help a unionized employee. No lawyer can. It has to be and it must be the union, okay? So with that out of the way, let's get right into it. Let's talk about mandatory vaccinations and the legality of these. So, let me start by saying that I don't want you to think in terms of legal or not, okay? Because at the end of the day, it may actually not matter. What matters is what's going to happen if your employer gives you an ultimatum and you don't follow that ultimatum. Because it's easy for me to say mandatory vaccines is illegal. I can say that, and in many respects it may be, but you still can't stop it. So even though it may be illegal, if you don't do what your employer says, ultimately you will lose your job or maybe be put on a leave of absence. So the first thing you always have to keep in mind is, am I willing to lose my job? Am I willing to be put on a leave of absence? Because again, from a practical standpoint, there's no way to stop that. Now, that said, if your employer does let you go because you didn't get a vaccine or because you didn't disclose your vaccine status, or if your employer puts you on a leave, okay, that in the eyes of the law amounts to a termination without cause, meaning your employer is going to have to pay you severance. Now, I know a lot of employers are saying, no, we're going to say that that's a termination for cause. We're not going to pay severance. Well, that's not something they're allowed to do. And yes, we can get you severance. And severance can be as much as 24 months pay. And I'll talk more in a little while about how we calculate severance and how much specifically you are owed. So the first thing I want you to understand is that it's easy to say something is not legal. And you may think, well, if it's not legal, we can stop it. No, you cannot. If your employer chooses to let you go, there is no legal mechanism to stop them from doing that. You will lose your job, okay? I know it's harsh, but you will. Now you will be owed compensation. You will be owed severance. Now, potentially, you could also be owed human rights damages in some situations. There's a strong argument that a mandatory vaccination policy on its face is a human rights violation. So you could be owed a human rights damages as well. Those tend to be not large amounts. But ultimately, don't focus, is it legal? Are they doing something they're not allowed to? Maybe yes, but you will lose your job. There's no way to stop that. So you have to keep that in mind always. Now, where things can get more complicated is if there is a government mandate. If there's a government mandate that requires your employer to have you vaccinated, if there's such a mandate, then in that situation, your employer doesn't have a choice in the matter. They're not deciding that. The government's telling them that they have to. So if there is a government mandate and you don't get vaccinated or you don't do what the mandate requires, at that point, your employer can let you go or put you on a leave of absence without pay, and there's no other consequences. They wouldn't owe you severance. They wouldn't owe you any human rights damages because it's not your employer deciding that. Now, mandates are very limited. So for people that work for the federal government in certain core positions, there's a mandate, but not if you're federally regulated. For example, if you work at a bank, there's no mandate. Telecommunications, there's no mandate. Hospitals. So in Ontario, for example, there's a mandate for hospitals, but it's not a vaccine mandate. It's a testing mandate. So if your employer, if your hospital that you work for says, if you don't get the vaccine, you're fired, that's not proper. If they say, if you don't agree to regular COVID tests, you're fired, that is proper, okay? Because there's a mandate. Long-term care homes in Ontario, there's a vaccine mandate. In Alberta, for example, public sector, there's a vaccine mandate. In BC, long-term care homes and hospitals and healthcare, there's a mandate. But for most other industries, there's no mandate. So if you are let go because your employer chooses to put in a policy, if you are let go because of that, regardless of what your employer says or thinks, that is ultimately a without cause termination. I can tell you, we've been inundated by people that have been let go over the past number of weeks because they did not vaccinate. And yes, we're helping them get severance. For some people, we've already, even though we just started, for some people, we've already been able to get their severance and the compensation that they're owed, because once we get involved, the employer realizes, yeah, we have to pay it. So a lot of employers are not necessarily thinking about that, but of course, they're going to have to pay you your full severance. Now, a question that is often asked is, do I have to tell my employer even? Do I even have to tell them what my vaccination status is? Well, arguably you don't. But again, let's go back to what I said before. If you don't, your employer will let you go or suspend you. And then we're talking about the compensation that you're owed. So again, there's no mechanism to stop that. So ultimately, don't ask yourself, is it legal? Ask yourself, am I willing to lose my job? For some people, the answer is yes. It's more important to me that I make certain decisions, even if it means losing my job, fine. Other people say, no, I don't want to lose my job, so I'll go do something else, I'll get the vaccine, etc. That's a personal decision, that's a personal choice. But I want you to remember that you can't rely on the law to save your job. You can rely on the law to get you the compensation that you're owed. You can rely on the law potentially to get you human rights damages, but you can't rely on the law to save your job, okay? Very important. Now, what happens if your employer says to you, okay, fine, you don't have to get the vaccine, but you need to get regular COVID tests. Now, if there's no government mandate that requires them to have you get regular COVID tests, if you refuse the regular COVID tests, and because of that, you lose your job, that is still a without cause termination, meaning you are owed severance. So in most cases, if in fact you refuse to have regular COVID tests, as long as there's no government mandate in play that applies to you, you are still going to be owed severance. Now, the exception to that may be a situation where your workplace has struggled with COVID-19 outbreaks. There's been outbreaks and clearly what they've been doing hasn't been working. In that situation, it may be reasonable for them to say, well, we have to do something else. Masking didn't work, social distancing didn't work. We have to do something else, and that something else is regular COVID tests. In that limited scenario, yeah, they may be able to say, if you don't agree to it, then you're going to be out of here without compensation. But in most cases, even if you ultimately don't agree to have regular COVID tests, you will still be treated in the eyes of the law as a termination without cause if you lose your job. Now, oftentimes people ask me, well, who pays for those COVID tests? Of course, if your employer says you have to pay for them, then you have an even stronger case to say that your refusal was reasonable, okay? Because they can get very expensive. If your employer wants you to do COVID tests 2-3 times a week and you pay for them and you say, no, that's reasonable. So an employer that wants to try to defend, quote unquote, a mandatory mandatory COVID test policy, at a minimum, right, they should be paying the full cost, the full price for it. So on the other hand, if you work at a hospital in Ontario, for example, and you refuse to have regular COVID tests and you don't get the vaccine, at that point, your employer may be able to let you go without any compensation because, again, we have this mandate called Directive 6 that applies in Ontario to hospitals. But again, that is a very limited thing. And in most cases, you're still able to refuse to have a COVID vaccine or a COVID test and still get severance. And we'll talk in a second about what that severance looks like. Now, for many people, they've been told, we're not going to let you go. We're simply going to put you on an unpaid leave of absence. And the question that I get is, can they do that? And how long can they keep me on an unpaid leave of absence? So the answer is that no. An unpaid leave of absence in the eyes of the law is the same as a termination of employment. We call this a constructive dismissal. So if your employer says, we're putting you on an unpaid leave of absence, you have two options. Option one is you can accept it and see what happens and wait and hope at some point they call you back. Option number two is you can treat that leave of absence as a termination of employment. Again, we call that constructive dismissal, and require your employer to pay you severance. Your employer may not be thinking about that. They may not realize that putting someone in an unpaid leave of absence is the same as a termination, but it is. The law treats it the same. So you have that right, you have that option. You may say, I'm going to treat that as a termination on day one. You may say, well, let me wait a little bit, see what happens. If they don't call me back to work in a couple of weeks, then I'll treat that as a termination and pursue my severance. You have that right, you have that option. If you find yourself in that situation, okay, then if you want to get your severance, if you haven't been paid severance, whether you've been let go or you've been put on that leave of absence, call my office, okay? Let's connect as soon as possible. We'll help you get that compensation. It's actually not a difficult process. And for those joining us, again, my name is Lior Samfiru. I'm the employment lawyer. I'm a founding partner of Samfiru Tumarkin LLP, largest employee side firm in the country. And to connect with me off Zoom to get more information about what we're talking about today, easy. You just go to employmentlawyer.ca. Again, employmentlawyer.ca. You can connect with me that way. If you want to have a private chat, or if it's time for me to help you directly to get your severance, to get your compensation, just go to employmentlawyer.ca. All right. Now, I've touched on this issue of severance. You've heard me say that a number of times, saying that if you are let go or suspended because you don't get the vaccine or because you don't get COVID tests, you are owed severance. So let's talk a bit about what severance looks like and what severance is, okay? So severance is not a week per year of service or 2 weeks per year of service. It's a lot more than that. Your severance is based on a number of factors: your age, your position, and the length of your employment. So the longer you work, the older you are, and the more senior position you have, the greater the entitlements, the more severance you are owed. And severance can be as much as 24 months pay if you work with a company for a long time. But even if you work for a company for a short period of time, a few months, you could be owed a few months severance. It's very, very, very common to have someone that say work for 6 months, they're let go and they're owed 4 months severance, 5 months, even 6 months severance. So very important to do that. Now, how do you find out right now, if you want, how much severance you are owed, whether you've lost your job or are worried about losing your job? Easy. You grab your smartphone, your tablet, desktop, whatever you want, and you go to pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. Again, pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. There we have our severance calculator tool. What is the severance calculator? Whatever, as the name suggests, it's a tool that allows you to find out in seconds how much severance you're owed. So you input your age, your position, and the length of your employment, and it's going to tell you whether it's 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, or anything else in between. It's free. It's anonymous. There's no names you have to put in, no credit card numbers, nothing at all that's identifying. And you find out there and then how much severance you're owed. And if you want to, and only if you want to, there's a button there at the end you can press to contact me directly so I can help you get that severance that you're owed. So severance is significant. Now, one factor that could potentially limit a person's severance is an employment agreement. What some employers do is they stipulate in an employment agreement or a job offer letter what they would have to pay you if at some point down the road they let you go, okay? So you may have signed an employment agreement not realizing that that agreement actually limits your entitlement. It's possible. There's many, many ways to get around it if in fact you did sign something like that, but that's something else to consider. So if you are let go or suspended, one of the things I'm always going to ask to see is to see a copy of your employment agreement, if you have it, or your job offer letter. If you don't have one, by the way, if you never signed a job offer letter or employment agreement, that's great. That's good news, okay? That's the best thing. So something to keep in mind. Now, when it comes to severance, severance is not just your salary. Severance has to include all components of your compensation. So salary, benefits, bonuses, car allowance, pension, stock options, everything that you would have received had you continued working. So if the severance for you, let's say, is 18 months, all you have to do is ask yourself, would I have received this had I worked for 18 months? If the answer is yes, I would have, then it has to be included as part of your severance. So it's not just your salary. Commissions, for example, if you get commissions, and if you're someone where the salary or the compensation varies from month to month, year to year, then we simply look at an average, okay? So it's all components of your compensation, not just your salary. I've spoken with thousands of people over the years where the company did not include bonuses and benefits, et cetera. And just because of that, the severance could have been short by tens of thousands of dollars. So a lot of you are going to face a situation where you're terminated for cause, at least that's what the company says. But here's what you need to know about a termination for cause. A termination for cause can only happen if the employee does something so bad that it's impossible to continue employing them. In that situation, then only can the employer let the person go without severance, without compensation. It is very difficult to establish cause. And in all other situations, your employer has to pay you severance. And what I've been saying to you on this session, I've been saying otherwise, is if you lose your job because of this vaccine or mandatory vaccine issue, that's not a cause termination. That's a without cause termination, meaning, of course, you have to get paid severance up to 24 months pay. So the one thing I want each and every one of you to do today, as soon as we're done here, or even as we're speaking here today, is grab your phone and go to pocketemploymentlawyer.ca, use our severance calculator tool there. You all need to know and have a right to know how much severance you are owed. Very, very important. So, and of course, as I said, if you lose your job for COVID-19 reasons, for vaccines reasons, or for any other reason, even if you're offered severance, in fact, in most cases, 90% of cases, when someone's been let go and they've been offered severance, that severance is inadequate, completely inadequate, 90% of the time. So it's absolutely vital that we speak, that you contact me so we can have that discussion, and I can help you, my team and I, get the severance that the law says you should have. Now, hopefully that helps with that on there. Now, the other question on severance, sometimes people have been asking me is, Well, okay, fine. You tell me I'm owed compensation, I'm owed severance if I lose my job. How long does it take? Obviously, every case is different. On average, cases take from 3 weeks to 3 months. Okay, that's the average. The vast majority of cases are going to resolve between 3 weeks and 3 months. It's rare that a case that takes less or more. So that's why it's not a long process. You shouldn't be afraid of the legal process. In 99.9% of cases, you don't even have to go anywhere near a courtroom. 99.9. The chances, the likelihood of you ever talking to a judge is minuscule. We'll resolve it. The law is not complicated, so it's very difficult for the employer to really argue or fight it. So it does not take long, unlike other cases, personal injury cases, for example, notorious, right, for taking years. Not employment law, not wrongful dismissal, not severance cases, few weeks, 3 weeks to 3 months on average. So something I want you to keep in mind, and of course, those joining us, my name is Lior Samfiru, the employment lawyer. To connect with me, have a private chat off Zoom, employmentlawyer.ca, again, employmentlawyer.ca. All the contact information, phone number, email address is there. Now, I want to focus now a bit on EI. A lot of times I get the question, okay, if I lose my job, do I get EI? And we have the federal minister coming out over the past week and saying, well, if an employee is terminated for cause for not getting the vaccine, they should not get EI, or they will not get EI. So here's why that's not something you need to worry about. Because if your employer says, we terminate you for cause, and they give you a record of employment that says cause, EI is not going to pay you. But that's not because of the vaccine. EI never pays if the record of employment says you're terminated for cause. But what did I say? I said that a termination in this situation is not cause. It's a without cause termination. So what happens? Well, once I get involved, my team get involved, not only do we negotiate and get proper severance, we also get a new record of employment that confirms that it's a without cause termination. And that will allow you to get EI, okay? So you may not get EI right away, unfortunately, because your employer may put on the record of employment that it's cause. And the EI is going to look at that and say, okay, cause, check mark, we're not going to pay. But once we resolve the matter, once it's done, you get severance, you get a new record of employment, then you will get EI. So whatever the minister said does not actually change the law. Really, EI pretty much always follows what's in the record of employment. And if the employer does the record of employment wrong, we get them to change it, okay? So because of that, I wouldn't stress out over EI. It may take a little bit. You may not get it on day one. Same thing, by the way, if you've been put on an unpaid leave. If you simply sit at home, you will not get EI. But if you choose to treat the unpaid leave as a termination, as I've been saying before, you have the right to do that. You can choose to say the unpaid leave is a termination. Because of that, I am going to get my severance. As part of that, we can also get you a new record of employment that confirms this is a termination. It's a without cause termination, and then you will get EI. So do not stress out over EI. I know a lot of people, that's a big deal, and of course it is. You've been paying into EI all these years. You will get it as part of the process. It just may not be on day one. And now, there are situations where you may lose your job. There's really one big situation, and there's not much you can do about it, and you're not going to be owed any compensation. So we talked about when there's a government mandate. If there's a government mandate, then you can lose your job, and there's not much that you can do. But there's another situation, and that is if you work, let's say, at a third-party location. So let's say you work in cleaning services, and your job is to clean an office building. That's your job. The office building doesn't employ you, the cleaning company employs you, but you clean the office building. Your job is to come in and clean that office building. If that office building, that third party says, you're not allowed in here unless you've been vaccinated, at that point, your employer's hands are tied. Your employer can't change that. It's not their decision. Your employer may not care if you've been vaccinated, but they're not able to have you work because of something a third party did. In that situation, it's unfortunately bad news. You can lose your job. We call this a frustration of contract. You can lose your job without any compensation in that scenario. So if the reason why you're not working is because a third party not your employer, but a third party decided that you can't come in unless you're vaccinated, then that kind of puts your employer or gets your employer off the hook. And you're not really going to be able to take legal action against that third party. It's certainly going to be very difficult to do. So in most cases, because of that, if it's your employer deciding you have to be vaccinated or else, yes, you have recourse, your own compensation, potentially human rights damages, certainly severance. If it's a third party deciding that, like in my cleaning the office building example, then no, unfortunately, it's going to be much more difficult, if not impossible, to get severance in that situation. So keep in mind, is it my employer mandating this, or is it a third party mandating this, in which case it's not good news. Now, I want to focus a bit on exemptions. And again, sorry for those joining us. I'm Lior Samfiru. To connect with me and my team, employmentlawyer.ca, but exemptions. So a lot of people want to get exemptions as a way to get around getting the vaccine. And there's really two main exemptions. One is a religious exemption, one is a medical exemption. So let's address both of them. Again, let's talk about practical. Most employers now, right or wrong, and I'm going to say wrong, are ignoring religious exemptions. So the likelihood of you getting a religious exemption is very, very small. Your best chance to get a religious exemption is to have a letter from a religious leader in your community, a priest, a minister, a rabbi, whoever the appropriate person is, talking about the fact that it is a belief of the religion that you shouldn't get the vaccine. If you can get that, you increase the chances of a religious exemption. If you simply send a letter to your employer explaining the reasons why you don't want to get the vaccine, you're not going to be able to get an exemption. It's not going to happen. Now, if you do have a letter from a religious leader, and despite that your employer says, too bad, we're not doing that, that could be another grounds for a human rights violation, meaning you could be owed additional damages because of that. But your best, maybe only chance of getting a religious exemption is not with a letter from you necessarily, but a letter from a religious leader in your religious community. Okay, best way to do that. And by the way, I can't help you with that. No lawyer can. It's something that maybe a religious leader can. Very difficult. Most employers are not providing that exemption. The other exemption is a medical exemption. Now, this is again where your doctor is judge and jury. What I mean by that is if your doctor feels that you cannot get a vaccine for medical reasons, as long as they give you a doctor's note to that effect, that is very, very powerful. Okay, that's going to be very hard for an employer to ignore or to deny. And if they do, there's going to be a big problem. Now, I know a lot of doctors are not giving those notes. Again, I'm not a doctor, I'm just a lawyer, so I can't say whether they should or should not. But the best way to find out is to talk to your doctor. If there is a medical reason, a medical issue, your doctor is going to have to decide if that reason is good enough or valid, but that is for your doctor to decide. I understand that certainly in situations where there's a history of negative reactions to vaccines, the doctor may be inclined to do that. But if you are able to get a doctor's note from your doctor, a medical doctor, not a homeopath, not a chiropractor, but an actual medical doctor, then yeah, that is probably the most likely way that you can get an exemption. And if you don't, if you have that doctor's note and your employer ignores that, that's a pretty serious human rights violation, and there will be legal consequences for that happening. So very good advice to get that doctor's note. But those are really the only exemptions. Now, I want to talk about a few myths, some misinformation that's going online that I need to clear up. So first of all, liability form. I think a lot of you have seen these forms going around that you hand to your employer saying, you know, you have to agree to all these things and you're going to be liable if something happens. Waste of time, waste of paper. Your employer is not even going to read that form. You haven't accomplished anything by giving that form. And whoever said that you should do that honestly doesn't know what they're talking about. That liability form is a waste of time. It's not going to accomplish anything. So save the trees. Don't send out those pieces of paper because it's not going to do anything. So that's certainly not useful. A lot of people have also heard about this Genetic Non-Discrimination Act. And that act says that you cannot be forced to do a genetic test. But here's why that doesn't apply to COVID tests or PCR tests. Because the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act is concerned with your genetic information. The PCR test is concerned with the genetic information of the virus. So the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act does not apply, does not do anything, does not help, does not give you rights, does not prevent the employer from doing anything, does not provide legal consequences on an employer or the government, frankly, if in fact they implement mandatory vaccines or mandatory COVID tests. So again, misinformation out there, I understand that, but the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act does not apply, does not. Finally, the charter. I know a lot of people say, isn't all this against the charter? So the first thing I want you to understand is that the charter only applies to government action. It does not apply to your employer. So regardless of what the charter says, so for example, the charter says the government has to allow you free speech. The government can't put you in certain dangerous situations. An employer is not bound by the charter. The charter has no impact on an employer. Now you may say, well, if the government imposes a mandate, can I challenge the government action based on the charter? The answer is yes, you can. But that is a process that's going to take a long time, a few years, okay? And it's not going to help you then save your job. If you're looking to save your job, challenging the government based on the charter is not useful. It's going to take years. It's a long and very slow process. So again, practically speaking, I like to focus on practical things even more than the law. You can't do much about it, okay? The charter is not going to be of much help here. It's about severance, it's about human rights, not really about the charter. So hopefully that helps clear up some misinformation. Now, I know I've covered a lot of subjects here. I know that I've talked to you about many things, and I hope that that helps clarify. I'm happy to start taking some questions now and seeing if I can answer them. Let's see here. So I have a question regarding government mandates and provinces. Clarify which provinces. Okay, yes. So first of all, we can only advise you in Ontario, Alberta, and BC, okay? BC has mandates with respect to hospitals, long-term care, home, Ontario as well. Alberta has a mandate with respect to people that work in the public sector. The federal government has also implemented mandates with respect to people that work for the federal government, not federally regulated, they work for the federal government. So because of that, it's important to understand that most of you are actually not governed by any mandates at all. Okay, so some more questions. Is there anything I should do or prepare for my termination or layoff date? How soon can I contact your team if I've been laid off? So the good news is that there's no work that you need to do to prepare for a termination. If the termination is going to happen, it's going to happen. All I want you to do is not preempt it. So if you know you're going to be let go on November 1st, don't stop showing up to work in October. Keep going to work. You're going to keep working. You're going to do your job. You're going to show up to work the same way, the same time, until your employer tells you otherwise. If you know your employer is letting you go November 1st, and so you're saying, okay, well, it's October 27th, I'm out of here, that's a resignation. Even though your employer said you're losing your job in a few days, if you preempt that, that's a resignation. And then you don't get anything. I heard from someone just before I got on the Zoom here saying that that's what happened. Instead of waiting till November 1st, they left. Well, that's a resignation. Don't let that happen. Now, when do you contact me? The best time to contact me is when the status of your employment has changed. Either you have been let go because of this vaccine issue, or you've been placed on a layoff or a temporary, you've been placed on an unpaid leave. So when something happens, so if your employer said, well, December 1st, we're putting you on a leave unless you get a vaccine, there's nothing that I can or need to do between now and December 1st. What you have to do as soon as possible is contact me Once that actually happens, then I can get involved right away, deal with it, get you the compensation that you're owed, etc. So the time to contact me, the time to contact my team is when something actually happens, not when your employer threatens you. Okay? Until something happens, you're going to continue working. Very, very important. And to contact me, of course, you just go through employmentlawyer.ca. Again, employmentlawyer.ca, the best place to do that. Next question I have here, what about remote workers? Are we actually subject to mandatory vaccination policies even though we work from home? So that's a question, of course, you have to ask for your employer. I agree with you that logically, if you're working remotely anyway, it makes no sense to be subject to a workplace vaccination policy. You're not there. So what are we trying to accomplish? But again, that's not the issue. The issue is your employer telling you that even though you work from home, if you don't get a vaccine, you're out of there. If that's what they're saying to you, again, regardless of how little sense that makes, you're going to lose your job if you don't do that. So because of that, it's important to keep in mind, you can't prevent that. You can't stop that. So ask your employer, and if you do lose your job, again, I think that would be silly, but if you do, let's talk about it. Let's get you the compensation that you're owed. It's going to be very difficult for the employer to defend a policy like that, right? Silly. But you can't prevent that if your employer decides to implement a policy like that. So what happens if a government mandate is passed or implemented after we've started working with you on your team? So you lose your job and there's no mandate, and a short while later, a government mandate is imposed. Well, that may somewhat limit your termination entitlements, okay? Depending on when that new mandate was put in, it may limit your entitlements. Your entitlements may be capped from the date of you were let go until the date of the new mandate. I don't expect new mandates are going to come, and the reason for that, some governments, including in Ontario, they said that we hope at some point in the winter or spring to lift all requirements. So I don't see them implementing new mandates. I have not heard of any new mandates being planned at this point, but it could limit entitlements if it does happen. Let's see, I'm just going to scroll here, see what more questions I can answer. So it says, if Ontario or other governments lift the proof of vaccination, are employers still able to keep their new policy that employees need to be fully vaccinated? Keep in mind, an employer is not allowed to have a policy like that to begin with. So I can't answer that. You're asking if it's already an illegal policy, can they continue it? Well, they're not allowed to have it to begin with. So all I can tell you is that regardless of what happens, whether or not Ontario or other governments extend mandates or vaccination requirements are extended or not, as things stand right now, if you're placed on the leave because you're not vaccinated, that's not something an employer is allowed to do if there's no government mandate. So let's see, next question. See here. So how can I tell the difference between a government mandate versus an employer mandate? How do I know that I'm subject to a government mandate? So as I said, Alberta, public service. BC, hospitals, long-term care homes. Ontario, hospital, long-term care homes. If you work for the federal government in certain core positions, mandates. But that's it, essentially. If you work in anything else, manufacturing, retail, you work even in other industries like travel, you may not have that mandate. Okay, so those are the mandates. And again, if you still don't know, just shoot me an email and I'll be able to tell you if there's a mandate that applies to you. Best way to do that is go to employmentlawyer.ca. All right, next question. If you are currently on a medical leave and your company is mandating a vaccination policy, do I have to comply while on my leave? So the question is, what does your employer want you to do? Because remember what I've said, remember my overall theme here is that if you don't do what your employer is asking you, regardless of the legality of what they're asking, you will lose your job. So I think I would tell my employer in that situation, well, I'm on a leave anyway right now, so we shouldn't have to deal with that. So I'll deal with it and I'll provide information once I'm able to get off this leave. Logically, an employer should say, yeah, that's fine. But if they say, I don't care, if you don't give me information by tomorrow, I'm going to let you go, that's a human rights violation, that's a wrongful dismissal, but that's what they're going to do. So your question always has to be directed to your employer to find out from their perspective, what are they planning on doing? You can't stop your employer from doing something that may be illegal, even doing something that's ridiculous. They're going to do it if they're going to do it. So that's what you have to find out from your employer. Can my employer refuse to pay earned vacation days if you're placed on an unpaid leave? No. Whether they let you go, put you on a leave, suspend you, if you've earned vacation days, they have to pay that, and you can get those. So there's no way for them to avoid that. Let's see here. Okay, does the information you've provided this evening apply to employees located in Canada that work for American companies with vaccine mandates? Are they allowed to have different policies for Canadians versus Americans? So if you work in Canada, Canadian laws apply to you. Even though you may be working for an American company, if you work in Canada, Canadian laws apply, whether it's Ontario, BC, Alberta, those are the laws of that jurisdiction apply to you. Meaning whatever your employer is allowed or not allowed to do is governed by those laws. Whatever you're owed, severance, human rights damages, is governed by Canadian and provincial laws. So the laws of your company's home state are irrelevant to you. They may be based out of Delaware, I don't know, not relevant to you whatsoever. The laws of your jurisdiction where you physically work is the only thing that matters, the only thing that applies to you. Okay, let's see. We'll continue. Sorry, trying to scroll here, guys. Next question I'm going to answer. What are the costs of working with your team for my severance? If I've been terminated without cause, can I be reinstated? So let's start with the reinstatement issue. There's no legal mechanism to force the company to reinstate you. Almost never. That's not possible. Now, if in fact, once we contact them and they realize, holy cow, it's going to cost us $100,000 in severance at that point, they may want to reinstate you. They may say, okay, fine, let's forget about this. Let's just bring you back to work. And if you agree, then you can go back. You don't have to. But there's no mechanism to force your employer to reinstate you. The only thing that the law can force your employer to do is pay you money, pay you compensation. And the question about the cost of working with my team. So listen, most of my clients, most of my firm's clients are people that have just lost their job. Because of that, they're in difficult financial situations. We understand that. And to tell them we're going to start charging you tens of thousands of dollars makes no sense whatsoever. No one can do that. Because of that, most of our cases are on a contingency basis. We put our money where our mouth is. We only get paid if we're successful. And in most cases, we negotiate that the company compensate a portion of those legal fees. And if we're not successful, if everything I've told you today is wrong, the only one that loses something is my team, because we would have worked for free. And I think also, hopefully that tells you how confident we are, because we wouldn't want to be working for free, right? Let's be honest. So I wouldn't pursue a matter if I thought that there's no merit, that we're not going to be successful. So if I'm telling you you will be successful, if I'm telling you that you are owed something, that should tell you how confident I am. Let's see, next question. If I lose my job because I don't get vaccinated, and there's no government mandate, and I sue my employer for severance and lose, will I have to pay my employer's legal fees? So the rule is loser pays winner's legal fees, but we're not going to sue if we're not going to be successful. This is not some shot in the dark. We're not throwing something at a board hoping that something will stick. No, we know what we're doing. The law is not complicated here. And if I tell you, my team tells you, you are owed 10 months severance, you're owed that, and you're going to get it. Now, we may have to beat up a bit on the employer to get it, but I wouldn't worry about losing. If it becomes a situation where we don't think you're going to be successful, we'll tell you that. So there's not going to be any surprises. And again, I never want you to think about winning or losing. It's really about how much ultimately you're going to get. Good question, by the way. So Next question, do I have to comply with the vaccination policy if I'm on a medical leave? I've answered that. Next question, my employer has denied my medical exemption, but says they will reconsider if my doctor provides a brief research he relied on to say I shouldn't get the vaccine. Is this reasonable? Absolutely not. No, it's not. Your doctor has no obligation to prove to them why he or she is right or what your medical condition is. And by the way, your doctor doesn't even have to tell them what the medical condition is. They don't have to. All your doctor has to say is there a medical issue that prevents you from getting the vaccine or isn't it? It's for your doctor to decide what's that issue and whether it's legitimate or not. That your employer doesn't have a right to know your personal medical information. Maybe you can't get the vaccine because you have a hormonal issue. Maybe you can't get the vaccine because you have epilepsy. I don't know. That is personal medical information. So if your employer is not satisfied with that, that's a problem. Your employer is violating human rights laws there potentially, and they're not going to be able to defend it. So you don't have to provide that information to your employer. I always like to say that your employer is allowed to know your prognosis, but not your diagnosis. What I mean by that is your employer can ask, how long is your issue going to last? What can we do to accommodate it? That's fine. But your employer can't ask, what is your condition? What medication you're taking? What specialists are you seeing? That's not relevant. By the way, the same thing applies if you need a medical leave of absence. As long as you have a doctor's note saying you can't work, that's all that matters. Your employer can't question what is the condition. Is it a herniated disc or are you suffering from depression? It does not matter. What matters is whether you can work or not, and that's what your doctor has to decide. Very good question there. Next question. Let's see. In what types of cases do human rights damages apply? So in the context of what we're talking about here, there's an argument that that a mandatory vaccine policy on its face, regardless of an exemption, is discriminatory because it differentiates between people who may have COVID and not. And because COVID is a serious medical condition, it's a disability, arguably it's a discrimination based on disability. So that's one way the human rights can interfere here or apply. Another is with respect to exemptions. If in fact you're denied a proper exemption, if there's a proper medical reason you're denied human rights violation. If there's a proper religious or medical exemption, as I said, and you're denied, that's when human rights factors in. So those, as relates to COVID vaccines, the main ways where human rights apply. Next question, if I accept the unpaid leave of absence, can I find other temporary work from another employer while I'm on leave of absence, or will that give my current employer reason to dismiss me with cause? So if you've decided that you're accepting the leave of absence, you don't want to treat it as a termination, you're content to sit at home and wait, if that's what you've decided, then yes, you can get another job. And that job, the fact you got another job is not cause. Okay, you have a right to earn an income to support your family. So if you work somewhere else while you're on a leave, that's fine. There's nothing that your employer can do to penalize you. It's not cause. Keep in mind what I said before. You don't have to accept the leave of absence. You have the right to treat that as a termination of employment and get severance. And for many people, that may be a better option. So if you're going to be placed on a leave, and if you're placed on a leave, you're not going to get EI, so you have no income. Well, if you choose to treat that as a termination, you can get severance, which could be months and months pay, and get EI as well. So for many people, I think treating the leave as a termination may be better than just accepting it and hoping that things will work out. All right, I'll take a couple more questions. Next question, does my employer have to give me notice of termination, leave of absence, or a layoff? If not, and any of the above happened to me, can I contact you and your team immediately to pursue severance? So when you contact me is once you've actually been terminated or once you're no longer in the workplace, unless of course your employer wants you to sign something. If your employer simply says, we're letting you go in a month, In the meantime, in this month, there's nothing that I can do. So you contact me at the end of that month. On the other hand, if your employer says, we need you to sign this thing immediately, no, you do not sign anything without speaking to me, okay? Please don't ever do that. You may think it's just not a big deal. You may not even realize what the legal implications of what you're signing are. So do not sign anything. But ultimately, there's nothing that I can do until something actually happens. Not the threat of something, not the notice of something, when something actually happens. Your employer doesn't schedule you to work anymore. They put you on a leave of absence. They flat out terminate your employment. That's happened. I get to work right then and there. And again, to connect with me, employmentlawyer.ca. Yeah, so I think this addresses next question what I was talking about earlier. What if the office space landlord has a vaccination requirement? Does this let all businesses that lease space in the building off the hook? The reality is it does. Because your employer can say, hey, we don't have a problem with you not being vaccinated, but we can't have you at work because the landlord's saying that. So that does get them, quote unquote, off the hook because it's not their decision. They're not choosing to let you go. They have no choice in the matter. It's as if someone is, it's a third party, kind of an outsider that happened to intervene here. So that is unfortunate, and I've seen that happen, and that is bad news, not even a question about it. So next question, if my contract limits my severance to 3 weeks per year work, can my employer really limit my severance? So I'd have to see the contract. There are, as I said before, there's many ways to get around a contract that tries to limit you, but I can't tell you if it does limit you or if we can get around it until I see it. It's possible for an employment contract to limit you significantly even, but I'd have to see it. So if you're not sure, if you have a contract and if you're not sure if it limits you, send me a copy of it. I'll take a look. I can tell you in 30 seconds if it limits you or not. And again, you can contact me. Email address, phone number is all there at employmentlawyer.ca. I'll take one more question. Are there any types of organizations that can be exempt from paying severance, like nonprofits, churches, small businesses? No. Great questions. Absolutely not at all. Size of the company doesn't matter. The size of the payroll doesn't matter. Number of employees, profit, non-profit, does not matter. If you have a job, if you're an employee and you lose your job, you are owed severance. Unless, of course, you did something horrible and there's cause, and then the company doesn't have to pay severance. But the type of company does not matter. I know there's a huge misconception there that only certain companies have to pay and non-for-profits. No. Any company, any employer has to pay severance if you lose your job. So that's very important to remember. By the way, full-time, part-time, casual, you get severance. So you ask yourself this: did I have a job and did I lose a job? If the answer is yes, I had a job, now I lost it, you are owed severance. It's as simple as that. And by the way, as I said before, to find out right now how much severance you're owed, now that we're ending this session, pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. Again, pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. We have our severance calculator tool there. You can find out in seconds how much severance you are owed, the actual number of months, and you can even calculate that in dollars, how much severance you're owed. Very first place you go to if you're worried about losing your job, lost your job, or if you're just curious. And guys, thank you very much today for joining me. Hopefully I was able to answer a lot of your questions. If you have other questions, that's okay. You can reach me and my team through employmentlawyer.ca. We can continue the conversation, answer more questions, and make sure you have the information that you need. And of course, if now as it's happening to so many, if you lose your job, can't stop that, unfortunately. If you're put on a leave of absence, can't stop that. But what you can do is get the compensation that you're owed. I'll help you with that. We've been doing that already for the last number of months, quite successfully already, and we just started. So contact me through employmentlawyer.ca. I'm Lior Samfiru, founding partner at Samfiru Tumarkin LLP. We can help you in Ontario, BC, and Alberta. Thank you very much. I know these are stressful times, so I appreciate you spending some time with me this evening. I wish you all the best and look forward to connecting in other ways. Thank you.